Hey everybody, this is section 2 from chapter 2 of part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, third period, 1938 to 1941, part 1, The Dominated. Part 2 of this book is titled The Militarized Working Class. Chapter 2 of Part 2 is titled Extension of the Wage Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. Section 2 is titled Come on, goddamn computer. Section 2 is titled The Authoritarian Determination of Working Conditions under the Development of Factory Despotism. In their effort directed toward the greatest possible exploitation of the worker, so as to gain the maximum accumulation, the authorities increasingly were led to subject wages and working conditions to unilateral decisions by the economic organs, and they tended to subordinate trade union activity to their preoccupations with production and profitability. In these conditions, the tendency predominated of, quote, fixing, end quote, by administrative decision, the volume of the wages distribution, and the levels of different categories of wage. As the volume presenting the first 5-year plan put it, quote, the wages question occupies a central place in the 5-year plan. It is here that the fundamental categories of the plan meet. The working class living standard, the development of labor productivity, production costs, the rhythm of accumulation, elements of the demand and supply equation. For the Soviet state, the wage question constitutes deep down the foundation of the plan. Footnote. No footnote. Something in Russian. Anyway, throughout the 1930s, measures multiplied for, quote, subjecting wages to the plan targets, parenthesis, especially the plan targets of the annual plans, which are themselves incorporated on enterprise plans, and parenthesis, and for fixing work norms that each producer had to fulfill in order to receive a predetermined wage. It will be seen that the carrying out of these measures did not permit effective coordination between the planned targets and the evolution of wages and labor productivity. Nominal wages, real wages, and worker productivity all developed according to rhythms and even orders that were very widely removed from the, quote, forecasts, end quote, of the plans. The scale and the permanence of these diverging tendencies showed that it was not simply a question of, quote, mistakes in planning, but of the absence, despite the plan, of a genuinely, quote, planned, end quote, economy. In fact, the real evolution of the economy was affected by class struggles and by the contradictions in accumulation, which had their repercussions on the movements of prices and wages. Although the measures taken to try to assure the achievement of plans relating to wages and work norms appeared to be ineffective, the measures taken to try to assure the achievement of plans relating to wages and work norms nevertheless produced important qualitative effects on production relationships and working conditions. The measures taken to try to assure the achievement of plans relating to wages and work norms had the result in particular of replacing collective labor agreements and negotiations with regulatory measures, and the measures taken to try to assure the achievement of plans relating to wages and work norms imposed new features on wage relationships. New section, Section A, the decay of collective agreements and the development of unilateral regulation of working conditions. According to the Labor Code of November 9, 1922, the wages paid in different industries resulted from collective agreements made between the trade unions and managements of industry. The same thing happened with working conditions, not working conditions not regulated by law. Individual contracts had to conform with the clauses of the collective agreements. Violation of the clauses of the collective agreements by industrial managements was cause for penal action, as was infraction of laws protecting the labor force. At the same time, there existed general agreements (for branches of the economy) and local governments. Local agreements. Jesus Christ, and local agreements. The Labor Code provided that agreements would only come into force after being registered by the Narkomtrud. Originally, this arrangement was to ensure that the labor power laws are not violated by collective agreements. However, after government decisions were taken to limit wage increases from 1926, the registration of agreements was used, among other methods, to keep wage increases within the limits fixed by the government, limits which in principle had to be respected in the course of negotiations. The Labor Code provided Jesus Christ. In fact, up to 1929, the trade union organizations were able to use the collective agreements to obtain working conditions that sometimes were more advantageous for workers than had been aimed at by the government's decisions and by the plans. At the beginning of the first 5-year plan, this attitude of the unions was violently denounced. For example, in Pravda of the 22nd of October 1929, published a, quote, letter from workers, end quote, which stated, quote, when collective agreements come up for renewal, backward groups of workers, stirred up by counter-revolutionary Trotskyites, right opportunist kulakophiles, will start pressing their non-proletarian and greedy demands. We appeal to all workers of the Soviet Union to put up the most active resistance to the attacks of grabbers, end quote. Quoted from Schwartz, page 186. That's the book by Solomon Schwartz. Between 1931 and 1933, several government decisions limited the substance of collective agreements to matters which conformed with the plan targets and the state regulation of wages. Collective agreements then became less and less useful and in fact were no longer signed. However, after Stalin had reproached the unions (in May 1935) for lacking interest in the workers' material and cultural needs, union organizations tried, in 1937, to conclude new collective agreements, but this effort had no results, or at least no results of practical significance. During the 1930s, the Soviet leaders reaffirmed that fixing wages was solely a matter for industrial managers, naturally within the framework of the tasks which were imposed on them, For example, in 1934, at a conference of industrial cadres, the then Commissar for Industry, Ordzhonikidze, declared, quote, as managers, responsible administrators, and foremen, you must personally occupy yourselves with wages in all of wages' current details, and not let other people handle this important question. Wages are the most powerful weapon you have, end quote. Ordzhonikidze. And in 1935, Andreev, a Politburo member, reaffirmed that, quote, wage scales must be left entirely in the hands of industry managers. Wage scales... I don't know if I'm reading this right. I might have been reading it wrong. Wage scales must be left entirely in the hands of industry managers. They must fix the norms, end quote. Andreev. The policy followed from the first 5-year plan resulted formally in a total concentration of wage-fixing power in the hands of enterprise managers charged with executing the measures concerning wages and norms ordered by the party and government in cooperation with the planning organs. In these conditions, the fact that the wages actually paid diverged constantly from those, quote, forecast, unquote, by the plans testifies to the scale of the economic and social contradictions, and of the failure to cope with the economic and social contradictions. The same might be said of the disappearance of collective agreements, since the procedures allowing workers to protest in a set form against the abuses of authority by enterprise managers and cadres ended with the development of arbitrariness and the decline of industrial working conditions. In this connection, the aesthetizing of the Commission by settling labor disputes (RKK) in the 1930s is especially significant. New section, Section B, the withering away of the RKK and the growth of the power of enterprise managers and industrial cadres over the workers. Let's see, RKK, Soviet. I'm not finding anything good for that. RKK is a commission for settling labor disputes. The RKK, Vrentsenochno Konfliktnaya Komissie. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right at all. Probably not at all. First saw the light of day in 1918. At the time, the RKK were purely trade union organs that decided wage policy. In 1922, the RKK's existence was recognized by the Labor Code, but the RKK assumed a balanced structure, with an equal number of seats for representatives of the enterprise management and representatives of the union committee. The RKK fulfilled two functions. On the one hand, the RKK fixed production norms, made decisions on the classification of posts, qualification scales, and other questions relating to working conditions. On the other hand, they had competence in settling any conflict resulting from a collective agreement and in examining any complaint by a worker about his work contract and the application of labor legislation. If not settled in this way, the complaint of a worker or group of workers could be passed to arbitration or to the jurisdiction of local organs of the Labor Commissariat. So there's two footnotes here. The first footnote says, C. M. McCulley, Labor Disputes in Soviet Russia, published in 1969, and Solomon Schwartz, also Volume 2 of Class Struggles in the USSR, by Charles Bettelheim. And footnote. Footnote. See the resolution of the 2nd of January 1933. A significant fact is that the resistance this decision aroused meant that it was not published until May 1933 in Trude, the magazine Trude, or the newspaper Trude. And footnote. These different functions of the RKK disappeared in the course of the 1930s. Fixing norms in the classifications of posts, qualifications and wages were removed on the RKK's functions. At the same time as collective agreements were decaying. At the level of each enterprise, wages and norms were fixed by a special department of the management, the Wage and Norm Bureau. In 1933, the Central Council of Trade Unions confirmed this situation. One of the trade union leaders of the time, Feinberg, explained that this decision, quote, was dictated by the necessity of ensuring within the enterprise the principle of one-man management and economic planning, end quote. Feinberg. Feinberg declared that to question this decision would imply, quote, a leftist opportunist deviation, end quote, which would be intolerable. The role of the RKK as organs of arbitration and jurisdiction also came to an end with the transformation of trade union organizations into mechanisms closely tied to enterprise managements and subordinated to a production political line. The last year for which statistics were published pertaining to union versus management disputes submitted to the RKK is 1929 to 1930. In that year, the number of workers involved in disputes initiated by union committees and enterprises was about 1 million, a decrease of about 47% compared to 1927-28. Subsequently, the statistics made no mention of such disputes. Up to 1933, the disputes could still be examined by the Truda, but the Labor Commissariat disappeared in 1933. Apparently, at this time, the tasks of Truda were handed to the regional trade union councils. The regional trade union councils disappeared in 1937. When the unions were reorganized, the union's judicial functions also disappeared. The unions had previously, in any case, become ineffective. Finally, the functions of the RKK and Truda in the matter of the claims of individual workers or groups of workers decayed, even though no change in the printed regulations marked this. In fact, the increase in the powers of the enterprise managements paralyzed the activity of the RKK. Moreover, the massive flow of new workers of peasant origin resulted in the absence of information provided by the unions, in sheer ignorance on the part of the majority of workers and employees that there existed organs, other than those of the Enterprise Administrative Service, to which they might address their complaints. In the old enterprises, the RKK functioned for a little longer in the early 1930s, but as the workforce increased, their function ceased. In general, they do not seem to have been even established at construction sites or in new enterprises. An inquiry instituted in 1932 covering 50 enterprises showed that by that time, the RKK were almost ignored by the workers and were not even informed about complaints. Those RKK which still existed functioned badly, and a large proportion of their decisions was annulled by the Truda. From 1935, workers who had complaints to lodge, notably about underpayment for overtime, non-payment of bonuses, or violations of labor legislation, addressed themselves only to the management. Very exceptionally, appeals were made to the courts, but usually no claim was formulated, even in cases of wrongful dismissal and of wages lower than they should have been, because the circumstances were not right. Those who disputed a decision could easily be accused of, quote, anti-Soviet, end quote, activity. As well, the tribunals almost systematically decide in favor of enterprise managements, so much so that the Justice Commissariat was obliged to call them to order, and certain abuses became too blatant. Even the frequency of these calls to order demonstrates their ineffectiveness. In general, official ideology and practice made it very difficult for workers openly to draw up a complaint. It was admitted that decisions had to be taken by enterprise management, and the questioning of these decisions, apart from, quote, obvious, end quote, violations of generally accepted regulations, was most often regarded as an attempt to attack the principle of one-man management and is indicative of a lack of discipline on the part of those making the complaint. Strikes were not forbidden explicitly, but workers were severely punished when workers tried to undertake collective action and protest against decisions involving wages, norms, and any other aspect of working conditions. The police soon intervened, and the courts applied paragraph 14 of Article 58 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, parenthesis, or the corresponding articles of the codes of the other republics, end parenthesis, which provided that, quote, the deliberate non-fulfillment by a worker of his obligations, or the worker's willfully negligent or those obligations willfully negligent execution, entails deprivation of liberty for a period of not less than 1 year, with total or partial confiscation of property. In the case of especially serious circumstances, the punishment may be the supreme measure of social defense, death by shooting, and confiscation of all property. End quote. Footnote. See the translations of the principal clauses of Article 58 in Robert Conquest's The Great Terror. End footnote. The growing and clear-cut support given by the unions in the enterprise management struggle for higher production and lower costs, the decay of the RKK and other organs in a position to examine workers' complaints, the ignorance in which workers were left about their rights, the pressures and threats against workers in the name of the, quote, necessity of fulfilling the plans at any price, end quote, all entailed consequences that led to the development of a factory despotism that was particularly brutal. A statement of M.M. Kaganovich in 1934 illustrates the conception held by party leaders at that time of the powers and functions of the enterprise manager. Quote, in the factory, the manager is king. Everyone must be subordinated to the manager. If the manager does not accept this, if the manager wants to play the liberal and at, quote, little brother, end quote, if the manager wants to spend time in persuasion, then the manager is not a manager, and the manager must not be in charge of a factory. Everything must be subordinated to the managers. The earth must tremble when the manager goes around the factory. Wikipedia says Mikhail Moiseyevich Kaganovich lived from 1888 to 1941, was a Soviet politician. He was the older brother of Lazar Kaganovich. Mikhail Moiseyevich was born in Kiev Governorate. A metalworker, Kaganovich joined the Bolsheviks in 1905 and fought with the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. In 1923 to 27, Mikhail Moiseyevich was based in Nizhny Novgorod, working on economic management. Mikhail Moiseyevich Kaganovich was transferred to Moscow in 1927. Mikhail Moiseyevich Kaganovich was a, quote, close friend, end quote, of Sergo Ordzhonikidze, and served as one of Ordzhonikidze's deputies from 1928 to 1936. In 1934, he was a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and an alternate member of the Orgbureau. He was appointed People's Commissar of Defense Industry from 1937 to 1939, and then People's Commissar of Aviation Industry from 1939 to 1940. Back to the text. Make sure I actually copy this quote down real quick. Okay. Back to the text. Those words crudely summarize the way in which enterprise managers were required to exercise their functions. This was far removed from Lenin's evocation of the role of a, quote, orchestra conductor, end quote. It was a case of an absolute authority which tolerated no opposition within the factory, while being in principle subordinated to the targets fixed for each enterprise by the party and government, targets enshrined in the plans. It was a whole ideology for the role of, quote, boss and, quote, director, which took form at this time and was cultivated in the engineers and cadre schools. The despotism of the factory, parenthesis, the term used by Marx to describe the discipline of a capitalist factory, end parenthesis, led to the development of arbitrariness in the matter of workers' wages. Footnote. Marx remarks that the direction of the production process, quote, necessarily becomes despotic, end quote, when the production process has a capitalist nature. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Marx also notes that the more the collective labor force grows, the more the function of surveillance is exclusively entrusted in a, quote, officer corps, end quote. Marx adds that this discipline that has been imposed would become, quote, superfluous in a social system where the workers worked for themselves, end quote. Marx. Capital. That quote I said before might not be from, actually from Volume 2. Because right here it says that last quote is from Volume 6. So I don't know what the volumes mean. I thought it was just referring to this typical, Capital Volume 1, Capital Volume 2, Capital Volume 3. Not only these, but production norms also were fixed unilaterally, and the workers lost all control over the way in which their wages were calculated and the deductions made from them. The latter became especially numerous from 1932 when the principle of, quote, material responsibility, end quote, of workers was applied to the case of defective production. Defects could entail significant reductions and even total loss of wages. Such wage reductions occurred even, quote, when defects have not been caused by the fault of the worker, end quote. For example, when the raw material was defective. Other deductions were provided for. In cases of work stoppage, even, quote, when the cause has nothing to do with the worker, end quote, the worker's wage was reduced, parenthesis, in principle by 1/2 the basic wage in the appropriate category, end parenthesis. It was vital that he inform the management immediately about the cause of the stoppage, for if he failed to do so, he would receive no wage at all and disciplinary punishment might be visited on him. The consequences of the hardening of factory despotism made themselves felt also as violations of labor legislation. New section, Section C. Violations of labor legislation. Labor legislation adopted during the early years of the Soviet Revolution, codified in 1922, was at the time highly favorable to workers and undoubtedly one of the world's most favorable. During the NEP, it was in the main applied in practice, but the trade unions and the labor inspectorate kept an eye on things. The situation began to change as the industrialization plan took form. Violations of the legislation were at first felt in the question of working hours and rest days, a field regulated by Article 60, parenthesis, rest days, end parenthesis, Articles 104 to 106, parenthesis, working hours and overtime, end parenthesis, and 131, parenthesis, working hours for pregnant or nursing women, end parenthesis. From the beginning of the 1930s, enterprise managers began to disregard the rules for overtime. Often managers imposed on workers working hours that exceeded sometimes considerably the limits fixed by law and without observing the prescribed procedures. Parenthesis, agreement of a parity commission and of the labor inspectorate, in parenthesis. Similarly, the rules for rest days were increasingly violated. When things went too far, some protests did appear in the press, notably in the Komsomol newspaper, but this same also praised factories and mines in which holidays had been all but abolished and in which overtime stretched a working day to 12 or even 16 hours. Most often, violation of rules about working hours and rest days were presented as decisions of the workers in the name of, quote, socialist competition, end quote. There can be no doubt that at the beginning of the first 5-year plan there was a certain enthusiasm for production. Especially on the part of youth. But it would not have been enough to cause such long and frequent increases of working hours. Moreover, the protests that the press from time to time published imply that long extensions of working hours were imposed by enterprise managements with the support of party organizations, even though, usually, the external forms of union democracy were, quote, respected, end quote. For example, when a workers' meeting was required to vote, quote, for or, quote, against, end quote, the enterprise's plan and to accept working hours that would allow the plan to be, quote, fulfilled, end quote. Quote, socialist competition, end quote, imposed by enterprise managements became a means of violating labor legislation without anybody daring to oppose the move. The following example, presented as, quote, positive, end quote, by the trade union newspaper, shows how far the extension of working hours could be taken. Quote, competition between the different gangs is taken in extraordinary form. As soon as the first gang has finished work and the second has started, the first gang strives to help the second gang. Shattered by fatigue, young men who have finished their first shift lie down, even at the place of work, on the bricks, and get up after 2 or 3 hours of sleep to continue working. End quote. Izvestia, November 7th, 1931. Repetitions of such practices damaged the workers' health and were an important cause of work accidents. At the start of the second 5-year plan, indifference to the workers' health was on such a scale that workers' discontent made itself felt and compelled the union organizations, in spite of their orientation toward production, to make protests. For example, Trude condemned the most blatant abuses and cited the case of the Moscow region foundries, where, quote, a group of foundrymen worked an average of 15 hours daily for 3 months. The workers became so tired that they left work while metal was still being poured, end quote. It also published an investigation by the Metal Workers Union revealing that in the enterprises of a Ukraine trust, quote, workers labor often 14 to 16 hours or more, and sometimes as much as 30 and even 23 hours, end quote. And it reported that in certain mines of the Donetsk basin, a basic night shift of 9 to 10 hours had been imposed. One second. Against those who refused to work the extra hours, the enterprise management applied punishments established for unjustified absence, or used the techniques of allocating the most arduous work to them. The articles from time to time published by the press to, quote, denounce, end quote, these practices did nothing fundamental to change the situation. In the factories, the union organizations continued to collaborate with enterprise managements in the name of, quote, fulfilling, end quote, the plans and of, quote, socialist competition, end quote. The constant violation of rules concerning working hours also had negative consequences on the quality of production, parenthesis, even more so as it was added to the increase of production norms, end parenthesis. The constant violation of rules concerning working hours led to a substantial deterioration of work relationship, which would cause Stalin in 1935 to condemn the indifference of the unions to this situation. The latter then responded, but only superficially, by means of simple protests, which did nothing to hinder the course of these practices. The same consequence occurred in 1927 when the head of the Trade Union's Central Council, Schwernick, stated that, quote, the abuse of overtime and of rest days is the area where most violations are committed against labor legislation, end quote. Trude, May 16th, 1937. This declaration changed nothing. Violations of the legislation continued, notably in the matter of working conditions for youths under 18 and pregnant women. Full statistics about work accidents stopped appearing at the beginning of the 1930s, but occasionally newspaper articles made evident the scale of the problem. Moreover, the regulations for safety and accidents prevention at work were likewise not respected by enterprise managements. For their part, the party and trade union organizations accepted this situation. The union press reported the extreme cases, but such formal protests had no effect on common practices. Among the case described by the union press, I think it's probably supposed to be among the cases, I'm not sure. Anyway, among the case described by the union press may be mentioned the presence of noxious gases in numerous workshops, sometimes reaching 10 times the authorized maximum limits. Lack of sufficient air supply in factories and mines, very poor visibility, unprotected machines, lack of insulation for high-tension cables, and so on. After 1936, the negative consequences, parenthesis, from the point of view of the authorities themselves, in parenthesis, of disregard for labor relations were such that many enterprise managers and engineers were condemned for having allowed the situation to develop in these ways. Many enterprise managers and engineers were then accused of being, quote, enemies of the people, end quote, and, quote, saboteurs, end quote. Parenthesis, even though the output and profitability plans imposed on the factories could only be more or less, quote, fulfilled, end quote, by violating safety regulations, in parenthesis. The, quote, Great Moscow Trials, end quote, indicated, up to a point, the scale of damage and even of catastrophes, parenthesis, notably on the railroads and mines, in parenthesis, that had been entailed by the policy of output growth at any price. The accused in the trials, quote, confessed, end quote, that it was on, quote, instructions, end quote, given by themselves that serious, quote, sabotage, end quote, was perpetrated. Parenthesis, they declared that they had acted as, quote, agents, end quote, of imperialist powers, Nazi Germany, Japan, etc., in parenthesis. The absurdity of these, quote, confessions, end quote, has often been shown. It is clear that this aspect of the trials was aimed at the deep discontent of the workers, the deterioration of working and living conditions being blamed on the officials, quote, responsible, end quote. It would appear that the sentences pronounced at the conclusions of the various trials were not enough to put an end to the multiplication of work accidents and catastrophes, for the accidents and catastrophes were due to the way in which the struggle for production was conceived. Nevertheless, the authorities continued to strive for the fulfillment at any price of the industrial and financial plans, despite the negative effects that this is in the end had on the situation of production and finance because of the enormous wastage of human and material resources entailed by this way of doing things. Practices which developed in these ways cannot be explained simply by the blind pursuit of output. Practices which developed in these ways have also a class character. These practices were the affirmation, carried to extremes, of the authority of the power holders, managers, and cadres who wished to break the resistance, including even passive resistance, of the workers, and impose on the workers factory, quote, despotism, end quote, of a most pronounced type. These practices demonstrated terrible scorn for the workers, which took the form of denouncing the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, outlook of workers who did not accept the orders of enterprise managers, and are often treated as, quote, class enemies, end quote, as such. They could be sentenced to deportation and to penal or penitentiary labor. The contradictions fostered by these practices were, however, so deep that the party, when not attacking them at their roots, was occasionally obliged to have enterprise managers punished. The end of the 1930s was marked by penal sentences against directors and engineers accused of, quote, sabotage, end quote, notably when accidents of excessive severity had occurred. But repression bore also on workers who denounced, quote, prematurely, end quote, that is, before rather than after an accident, end violations of work safety regulations. C. Schwartz, footnote, C. Schwartz, pages 293 to 303. This author shows that the work inspector was made incapable of performing its duties. End footnote. Violation of labor legislation. And the multiplication of accidents at factories, mines, and construction sites stemmed from a violent anti-worker offensive and from an unrestrained struggle for increased growth and immediate profitability of enterprises. The judgment that Marx made about the functioning of capitalism can be unreservedly applied here, notably where he writes that it is, more than any other system of production, a waster of men, of living work, a squanderer of flesh and blood, and also of nerves and brains. These characteristics of capitalism developed during the 1930s in factories employing, quote, free, end quote, workers. Footnote. Contingents of detainees could also be allocated to these production units. It was then a matter of the penal colony workers rather than those of the labor camps. End footnote. These characteristics of capitalism developed during the end footnote. It will be seen that in conditions of forced labor, they assume gigantic proportions. New section, section D. The toughening of labor discipline. The severity of labor regulations intensified throughout the 1930s. The evolution of punishments inflicted on workers for, quote, unjustified absence, end quote, and the definition of such an absence demonstrate the toughening of labor discipline. By virtue of Article 47 of the Labor Code, as it was revised in August 1927, the fact of having been absent for a total of 3 days in 1 month, without such absence being properly authorized or justified for medical reasons, was punished by dismissal without notice or compensation. On the 15th of November 1932, Article 47 was revised by a decision of the Central Executive Committee and of Sovnarkom. Henceforth, a single day of absence was cause for dismissal without notice or compensation. The enterprise management was not only authorized to apply this punishment, but was required to do so. Punishments for unjustified absence became more severe by 1932, by virtue of this decree, as well as by a directive of November 26, 1932, and another decree of December 4th. Footnote, see Schwartz, page 99, and see Tony Cliff, Russia, a Marxist Analysis. Among new punishments applicable to cases of unjustified absence, the expulsion of a, quote, guilty person, end quote, from his lodgings, if the latter were provided by the enterprise, should be mentioned. The rules specified that this sanction was to be applied equally to the family and was to take no account of the unavailability of alternative accommodation nor of the season, parenthesis, which means that this punishment was especially serious in winter, in parenthesis, nor of the absence of means of transport. This dismissal was additionally accompanied by the withdrawal of ration cards. At that time, this was a measure of extreme gravity, for without a ration card, recourse could only be made to the, quote, free market, end quote, where prices were exorbitant. A subsequent decree dated June 27, 1933, specified that the expulsion from accommodation would take place even if the latter did not belong to the enterprise but had been put at the disposal of the enterprise's personnel by a housing or house building cooperative. Following the adoption of the measure, the average annual number of working days lost by unjustified absence per worker fell from 5.95 in 1932 to 0.93 in 1933 and 0.67 in 1934. In spite of this change, which was maintained in the following years, a campaign was begun during the fall of 1938 against the, quote, shirker, end quote, Pogulschik, quote, idlers, end quote, and other, quote, greedy individuals. On the 28th of December 1938, this campaign culminated in the adoption of a new decree, quote, for strengthening labor discipline, improving the application of social insurance, and combating abuses in these fields, end quote. Izvestia, December 29, 1938. This text was an important step toward the, quote, penalization, end quote, of labor law. Henceforth, any late arrival at work, any early departure at midday or in the evening, any, quote, loafing, end quote, had to be punished. Had to be punished. The punishments were warning, reprimand, severe reprimand with threat of subsequent punishment, transfer to less well-paid work for up to 3 months, and dismissal. Any wage earner who was the object of 3 disciplinary measures in 1 month, or of 4 in 2 consecutive months, was considered guilty of unjustified absence and had to be punished for the latter offense. On the 8th of January 1939, a new decision of the government, the party and the Central Council of the Trade Unions, once more hardened the regulation of labor. By virtue of this text, any lateness for more than 20 minutes was regarded as, quote, unjustified absence, end quote, and punished as such. At the end of 1938, prison sentences were pronounced against managements or enterprise cadres who had failed to punish workers liable to punishment under Articles 109 and 111 of the Penal Code. The following weeks, thousands of dismissals were pronounced for, quote, unjustified absence, end quote. Fear of disciplinary sanctions then became a constant worry of many workers. Some of them gave up their midday meals so as not to risk a late arrival after the break. Visits to medical services and dispensaries became less frequent because the workers feared punishment after not being, quote, recognized, end quote, as ill. Pressure was put at the same time on the doctors so that the number of sick notes issued at the beginning of 1939 fell by 50%, which the press regarded as a victory over, quote, malingerers, end quote. Thus, the measures taken at the end of 1938 and beginning of 1939 had above all a repressive nature. It was a matter of putting workers in a situation of strict subordination. A supplementary step was taken toward the virtual penalization of, quote, labor law, end quote, with the adoption of the law of June 26, 1940, whose Article 5 provided that, quote, an unjustified absence, end quote, would give rise to judicial prosecution and would be punished by, quote, correctional labor, end quote, carried out at the place of work for a maximum of 6 months, and with a deduction from wages that could go as high as 25%. It has already been seen that from September 1940, quote, correctional labor, end quote, was regarded as an interruption of employment and could result in a worker losing a great part of his previously won Social Security rights. The Justice Commissariat and the Procuracy required the courts to stretch to a maximum the definition of, quote, unjustified absence, end quote, quote, loafing, end quote, during working days, thereby qualified as unjustified absence. Also to be obligatorily considered as guilty of unjustified absence were those who did not observe their management's decisions about work to be done in overtime or on holidays, even if the overtime was ordered illegally, because it was not the worker's place to, quote, judge whether the conditions required for working overtime are present, end quote. Also punished for unjustified absence were workers absent from work with the permission of the management. Quote, if it later transpired that the requested authorization, granted in good faith, was objectively illegal, end quote. That is, did not correspond to a case where absence could be authorized. Fearing that certain courts were hesitating to apply the law of June 26, 1940, in all its rigor, the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet adopted, on August 15, 1940, a decision that required judges to consider only the fact of, quote, unjustified absence, end quote. It was thereby forbidden to take account of favorable testimony about an accused, showing that he was an exemplary worker, a Stakhanovite, etc., because it was stated those who absented themselves from work, quote, could not possibly be Stakhanovites or exemplary workers, end quote. As a result of such directives, even sick or injured workers were sentenced for, quote, unjustified absence, end quote. So much so that in December 1940, new directives were issued that sought to avoid the most shocking sentences. All the same, at this time, judges were reminded that they should not display any, quote, liberalism, end quote, and that the provisions of the Penal Code concerning reductions and suspensions of sentences did not apply to cases of, quote, unjustified absence, end quote. Parenthesis, and it might be recalled that these cases even involved workers accused of 20 minutes of, quote, loafing, end quote. End parenthesis. The provisions of the law of June 26, 1940, which provided for prison sentences in case of, quote, recidivism, end quote, remained in force until April 1956. The ideological relationships that were predominant within the privileged strata at the beginning of the 1940s are demonstrated in a meaningful way by readers' letters to Izvestia, demanding that domestic servants be made liable to the law of June 26, 1940. The editors of Izvestia did not think that such an application was practicable, but did not seem to be surprised at receiving such a demand. Thus it may be said that in the 1930s there took place a radical change in working conditions. Measures concerning hiring and firing, compulsory transfers of jobs, organized recruitment, and instituting a very severe factory despotism gave unprecedented powers to those who controlled access to means of production and utilization of the resultant products. The anti-worker offensive also affected, as will be seen later in wage and norm fixing, and the development of norms and wages. It tightly bound the workers to the requirements of accumulation and the utilization of the means of production. While affirming that this situation was that of quote, achieved, end quote, socialism, the leading party condemned all questioning of the existing order as, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote. The defeat suffered by the workers was both social and political. That's the end of this section. Thank you so much for listening.